John Kiriakou, a former CIA agent, told American Broadcasting Company News he helped capture Abu Zubaydah, accused of being Osama bin Laden's main al-Qaeda advisor, as well as the torture practices carried out by the CIA in their secret black sites. Obviously, this had a huge impact on his career, and he was expelled from the CIA and convicted in the following years. Still the only American ever convicted and imprisoned for exposing an undercover agent's identity. We won't discuss this further, as it's not our focus. What matters is what he says about the behind the scenes of the meetings preparing for the war in Iraq, and also about the situation in the Middle East. Today, his revelations on a podcast in the United States give us a very important view of the geopolitical context of what is happening now in the Middle East. But before that, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share the video with everyone you know. To help the World Geopolitics channel keep growing, your support is very important. I'm World Geopolitics, and this is my channel. The former CIA agent John Kiriakou had significant relevance within the American intelligence agency. He had extensive experience in the Middle East long before September 11 and participated in the capture of important al-Qaeda assets. Because of this, he was behind the scenes at several high-level meetings involving the planning of CIA operations and the war in Iraq. But the point he mentions about these meetings is very important to give us an idea of what the United States' real plan was in Iraq and after Iraq.
So it's summer of 02 now. You go back home. Yep, Abu Zubaydah goes to his first black site, which we'll certainly come back to. So you get home that summer, and what was your involvement in, or how did the planning for the Iraq war come about?
So, in the counterterrorist center, everybody was so excited about Abu Zubaydah. I went home. It was so funny. First day back at the office, I punch in the combination to get into the vault, and I open the door and I walk in. What is the vault? Oh, every office in the CIA is like a bank vault. Okay. So you need combinations, sometimes multiple combinations, to get in because they're all secure areas. So I do my combination to get in. I walk in and a couple of the guys see me and one of them goes like this. And I said, no. It was a team effort. He said, "You're my hero." I replied, no. And my boss comes out. He's like, "Oh my God, you're a legend." And I didn't know anything that was happening at headquarters. I was so busy in Pakistan. And he goes, "The deputy director wants to see you." I said, "Really? Jim Pavitt?" "Yeah." I said, "Cool. Glad I wore a tie." So I go up to Pavitt's office and he said, "I just want to shake your hand. Thank you for what you did in Pakistan." And he said, "We want to offer you a new position. We want you to be Chief of Counterintelligence in Alex Station, the Osama bin Laden unit." So this was a job that put me in charge of trying to root out al-Qaeda moles, trying to identify CIA officers. It's a tough job, let me tell you. I only did that for 6 weeks because my station chief in Pakistan, on the strength of the Abu Zubaydah capture, was promoted to Associate Deputy Director for Operations. So he calls me and he says, "You need a job?" I said, "Actually, no, I just got a job. They put me in charge of counterintelligence for Alex Station." He said, "They made me Associate Deputy Director, and I want you to be an executive assistant on the 7th floor. I said, "Oh, done. Jose Rodriguez was so mad at me. He never forgave me for that. He actually passed me over for promotion. He said I displayed a shocking lack of commitment to counterterrorism. Can you imagine? Because I left the counterterrorism office to go up to the executive floor. So I didn't care. And then the deputy director promoted me anyway over Jose's objections. So my first day on the job was the following Monday. And I go in and I said, okay, so what are we doing? And he says, I actually can't tell you. You have to go to this room on the 6th floor, and there are some secrecy agreements for you to sign, and then we'll tell you what we're doing. And I said, okay. So I went to the 6th floor and knocked on the door, and I knew the guy who told me to come in. I said, oh, hey, what are you doing? He replied, so you're the new executive assistant. Wow, you've made a heck of a path for yourself. I said, yeah, I got lucky. Pakistan was totally positive. I said, what are we doing? He said, why don't you sign these first, then I'll explain. So there were 6 of them, and I signed 6 secrecy agreements saying I'll never ever reveal what I'm about to learn unless it's declassified, which it has been. So I signed and said, okay, what's up? And he goes, well, now this is May of 2002. 2002, he goes, well, next year in February, we're going to invade Iraq. We're going to overthrow Saddam Hussein. And we're going to open the largest Air Force base in the world so that we can move all of our air assets out of Saudi Arabia and deprive Osama bin Laden of the ability to say that we're polluting the land of the 2 holy mosques. I was dumbfounded, and all I could even blurt out was, but we haven't caught bin Laden yet.
The first thing to note here is how the idea around invading Iraq was actually to relocate the American military presence from Saudi Arabia to Iraqi territory, partly because it would be a way to ease tensions with the Islamic community, and also the image of foreign occupation in Saudi Arabia, where the holy sites of Islam are located, for example. Mecca.
He said, buddy, the decision's been made and the battle lines have been drawn. He said the CIA is opposed to this, the State Department is opposed to this, and the Joint Chiefs are opposed. But the ones that are for it are the Office of the Vice President, the Office of the Vice President, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Council. And I said, so the decision's been made? He said, the decision's been made.
Here it's interesting how there was this internal political division within the American government. The military, the CIA, and the State Department, which in Brazil would be equivalent to our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, were opposed to the attack on Iraq. It was a top-down decision made without consultation by the Secretary of Defense, who at the time was Donald Rumsfeld, and the Vice President Dick Cheney, who was the Vice President of then President of the United States, George W. Bush. And for those who don't know, he was actually the real President, Dick Cheney. The country's strategic decisions were made by him and not by George W. Bush, who, unlike his father, George Bush, who had been CIA director, was a leader lacking the leadership or savvy for the position, leaving the less interesting matters, so to speak, for Dick Cheney to handle. But these less interesting matters were actually the most important ones for the nation.
So I walk back downstairs and the boss says, so you're read in? And I said, are they out of their minds? And he said, yes, they are. But we're not a policy agency, we're a support agency. And if they tell us to invade Iraq and overthrow Saddam Hussein, that's what we're going to do. And so that's what we worked on until we invaded Iraq and overthrew Saddam Hussein.
So Tennant was the director at this time, right? Yes. And didn't you? I don't know if it was the same day or not, but walk by his office and see him doing a little art project in there.
Oh, it wasn't. Tennant?
Okay.
I went up to it was the chief of something called the Iraq Operations Group. I had to pick up a briefing book. There was a principals meeting. The principals meeting, it's a policy meeting chaired by the vice president. And it has the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, CIA Director, National Security Agency Director, and Chairman and Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So I went to pick up the book, and the chief of the Iraq Operations Group is sitting there with a piece of paper and some Crayola. What do you call them? The crayons? No, not the crayons, but the magic markers. I go, what are you doing? He says, oh, I'm designing the new Iraqi flag. I said, don't you think the Iraqis should design the new Iraqi flag? He goes, I don't know. I thought I'd do it. And I said, you're using the colors of the Israeli flag. Like, this is what happens when they put a Mexican guy in charge of the Iraq operations group. I said, buddy, the Iraqi flag is the colors that it is for a reason, right? You got to have green because it represents Islam. Red is necessary because it represents the ethnic minorities, right? You got to have the 3 stars because that represents the Sunnis, the Shias, and the Kurds. You can't just take the Israeli flag and change it around a little bit. So thank God nothing ever came of that. But they were serious. It got worse than that. That was ISO.
This also shows the absurd and enormous lack of knowledge about the situation and what Iraq was as well. Because that's impressive, this lack of cultural and historical knowledge, and it's nothing new for the CIA because this was also a problem in Vietnam. They simply didn't know anything about the Vietnamese, and as a result, they didn't know how they thought or what they really wanted. Which is a very, very important foundation in the intelligence field. However, besides the relocation of military forces from Saudi Arabia, there was another process in this plan which is the really interesting part. The final objective, according to Kiriakou, was not Iraq.
It got much worse. How so? People just getting too cocky? Well, the day before we actually crossed the border, there was a final, it's called an order of battle meeting. I always hated them because I'm not a military analyst. And I just don't care where elements of the 5th Army Corps are in comparison to the 3rd Infantry Division. I don't care, right? Let the generals figure that out. I trust in their judgment. You don't have to tell me that the 23rd Infantry Mounted Division is. I don't care. So George asked me to be the note taker in this meeting. George Tenet, the director of the CIA, asked me to be the note taker. And the meeting was chaired by the vice president. So it was Cheney and his guys like Scooter, Libby, and a couple of other people. Condi Rice, Colin Powell, the chairman and vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Don Rumsfeld, Condi's deputy, Steve Hadley. I couldn't remember his first name. He was there. And then General, I forget his name. He was commander of United States Central Command at the time. He had replaced, Schwarzkopf, Hoare, and others who came after Schwarzkopf. General Taylor, right? Maybe Taylor? I can't remember anymore. So Cheney starts the meeting. General, why don't you give us the order of battle? I'm like, so I'm sitting. George is at the head of a conference room table and everybody else is on a television screen, right? And George's microphone is right in front of him. And he's just sitting there like this, and I'm sitting directly behind his right shoulder, taking the notes. So we're sitting there and they're like, the 5th Army Corps is in this position and the 23rd Infantry is here. They're moving north, this one's heading west, and another's coming south, and so on, blah, blah. And I'm writing it all down. And then the general says, if all goes as planned, we can be in Tehran by August. George is sitting there, and then he leans forward and turns off his microphone. And he says, did he say Baghdad or did he say Tehran? And I said, he said Tehran. And George says, have these people lost their minds? And then he turns the microphone back on and just sits. So I'm taking all the notes. And one of these idiots from the National Security Council says, when we cross the border, they're going to throw flowers at us. And I wrote it down. After the meeting, I returned to the deputy director's office. He asked, how'd it go? And I said, did you know we were going to invade Iran? And he goes, ooh, are they still talking about that? And I go, yeah, they said we could be in Iran by August. And he goes, listen, we're not invading Iran. We're probably not even going to be successful in Iraq. But these guys don't know anything about the Middle East. Nothing. We're not going to invade Iran. They talk about it like they think they know what they're talking about, and they don't know anything. I go, okay, I hope you're right. As expected, we got stuck in Iraq and never approached Iran.
As you mentioned, this is during the global war on terror.
Yep, right, smack in the middle of it.
The focus is on bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Tenet is not psyched. Iraq,
Right?
but the direction to move forward is coming from Cheney and a few other folks that you just mentioned. There was somebody who was feeding Cheney information to substantiate those claims that Saddam had WMDs. That's right. Chalabi.
Ahmed Chalabi.
Who is he?
I always disliked this guy. From the start, I thought he was a shady used car salesman. Ahmed Chalabi was an Iraqi Shia Muslim Kurd, which made him one of like 0.5% of the Iraqi population. He left Iraq as a child. In 1964, his parents fled to Jordan. And Chalabi went to school in London and became quite a prominent banker. But he was also a crook and a criminal. And so he opened a bank in Jordan that was specifically meant to cater to the needs of Iraqi refugees. It was a Ponzi scheme. He stole all their money, totaling $36 million in deposits. He escaped in the trunk of his secretary's car across the border into Syria, and then from Syria made his way to London. In Jordan, they filed charges against him and found him guilty in absentia and sentenced him to 30 years in prison. But Chalabi was able to convince the neocons and the Republican Party that he was the only person who could unite Iraq, and that he should be the president of Iraq, and that the United States should install him as the president of Iraq. So after the first Gulf War, the George Herbert Walker Bush administration said, hey, we should take a look at this guy, Chalabi. Well, those of us at the CIA who knew Chalabi were writing until our fingers were raw, saying, this is a huge mistake. This guy's a criminal. He's gonna rob us blind. He's a liar. He's making it all up. And then the money that we began to funnel to the Iraqi National Congress, which was this exiled Iraqi opposition group that Chalabi headed, began to disappear. And finally, when $6 million of the CIA's money couldn't be accounted for, the CIA issued something called a burn notice against Chalabi, forbidding any CIA officer anywhere in the world from having any contact with Chalabi. You're burned, you're done. Well, what Chalabi did was he increased the level of his relations with the Republican Party, saying, if those lefties like George Herbert Walker Bush won't have me, maybe the Dick Cheneys of the world will. Well, after the Clinton administration was done and George W. Bush won and Dick Cheney was the vice president and Don Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense, they like what Cheney is providing. Cheney's giving them this intelligence that is everything they want to hear. Saddam has WMDs and plans to use them against the United States. Saddam is going to launch an attack on Kuwait again. Saddam's going to attack the Saudis. Saddam was rumored to attack United States military bases in Jordan or Turkey, but none of it was true. He was just making it up. So we went to Cheney and we said, look, this guy is a known liar. He's a known fabricator. He's a thief. And everything he says is unreliable. So what they did is they told Chalabi to start reporting through the United States Defense Attaché in Amman. So we started getting these classified cables called DODIRs, Department of Defense Intelligence Reports. Yeah, and they're like weapons of mass destruction were found at such and such coordinates. And we're like, oh my God, what's the source of this report? I'd call the Pentagon. Hey, I'm looking at DODIR 12,345. Who's the source? We're not at liberty to share that with you. What do you mean? I'm the CIA. You have to share it with me. It's a particularly sensitive source. We're like, bullshit, this is Chalabi. So we put out the word and the rest of the intelligence community. You can't listen to any of these doders, it's all made up. But that was the information the Pentagon was using to justify the attack on Iraq. It was all fabricated. Now, to make things more difficult.
This is very important because it shows that Iraq, in Washington's view, was just a stepping stone for a much larger invasion, for a bigger goal, Iran, which would then in fact be much harder to take precisely because it was bigger and militarily stronger. The messianic idea that the Iraqis would celebrate the fall of Saddam Hussein, welcoming the Americans as heroes, shows this complete blindness the Americans had about reality and about themselves. They genuinely not only believed that Iraq would be a walk in the park, but also that they would be seen as liberating heroes. All this would happen quickly and easily, and within a year they would be marching in Tehran, Iran's capital. Part of this illusion was because in the 1990s the United States went to wars that were pathetically easy to win, with the exception, of course, of the operations in Somalia, but they avoid talking about that as much as possible. After the moral crisis of Vietnam, Americans spent the 1970s and 1980s reinventing themselves militarily. The risk of their military structure collapsing in the face of a supposedly hyper-powerful Soviet Union, which later turned out not to be so powerful after all, was considered something real and immediate. But one of ours, A. and Barata, against the Iraqi forces in Kuwait and later in the campaigns in Yugoslavia. They gave the impression to many military analysts, not just Americans, that the future of war would be highly technological. And because of that, American military capabilities were far, far beyond any rival on the planet. And it would make it so that no country could stand up to the United States. So, the idea of defeating Saddam Hussein's weakened and worn-out forces seemed like something simple. After all, what the Iraqis had in 2003 was just a shadow of the powerful Iraqi army from the early 1990s, which, besides having been crushed a decade earlier in Kuwait, had now also suffered through 10 years of heavy sanctions and embargoes that devastated Iraq's infrastructure. Everything pointed to it being easy and turning Iraq into a platform for America's real rival in the Middle East. The problem is that toppling the regular forces of the Iraqi government was actually easy, and that goal was achieved in 2 months. But dealing with the remaining Sunni Iraqis and the Shiite militias supplied and trained by Iran was a nightmare. Iraq was not a bridge to be built in less than a year, but a lamassu that cost and trapped the United States for more than 10 years. In the end, in this indirect conflict with Iraq, the Americans ended up defeated. The war between Iran and the United States never actually happened in the way people imagined. Directly, but indirectly, Iran dealt significant military and political defeats to the Americans. The signs that this would be a disaster, however, had already been ignored by Washington long before the war, back in 2002 when the Millennium Challenge 2002 exercise was conducted, which was a military simulation, the most ambitious and costly military simulation in American history up to that point. This simulation put the American military as the blue team, with capabilities projected 5 years into the future at that time, against a potential unnamed adversary which was the red team, with the intended result of informing future strategic and acquisition decisions. The controversy surrounding the exercise arose immediately. Also when the opposing force, this red team which was supposed to represent Iran, found out that the results were scripted, to ensure that the American forces would win no matter what. Doesn't that defeat the purpose of the simulation? Writing in September 2002, New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof warned that it should have taught us a clear lesson related to Iraq. Arrogance kills. And why did he say that? The leader of the opposition force, the Red Team, which would represent Iran, was retired 3-star Marine Corps General Paul Van Ripper. Developed over 2 years, at a cost of $250 million, it would grow. This exercise involved 13,500 service members at 17 simulation sites and 9 live force training locations. It was promoted by Pentagon officials as a demonstration of leap-ahead technologies. And it aimed to provide commanders with dominant knowledge of the battle space to conduct rapid and decisive operations against future adversaries. more specifically again the Iranians. However, the Red forces, led by General Van Ripper, easily sank an entire aircraft carrier battle group in the simulation, even though this Red team was supposed to represent a materially inferior Middle Eastern country. And this happened in just the first 2 days of the simulation. In addition, he adopted an asymmetric strategy. He used old methods to evade his opponent's sophisticated electronic surveillance network, using virtual motorcycle messengers to instantly transmit orders to the frontline troops. Light signals from the World War II era. To launch planes without radio communication and fishing vessels as launch platforms for anti-ship missiles that outperformed the platforms themselves. He used a fleet of small boats to determine the position of the opponent's fleet on the second day of the exercise. In a preemptive strike, he launched a massive salvo of cruise missiles that overwhelmed the Blue Force's electronic sensors and destroyed 16 warships. This included an aircraft carrier, 10 cruisers, and 5 of the 6 amphibious ships. An equivalent success in a real conflict would have resulted in the deaths of more than 20,000 American military personnel. Right after the cruise missile offensive, another significant portion of the opposing navy was sunk by an armada of small red boats that carried out conventional and suicide attacks. They took advantage of the blue team's inability to detect them, as well as expected. In other words, the simulation, which was supposed to show America's overwhelming superiority over a militarily inferior Iran, was a complete failure. But since the plan had to be followed at any cost, the simulation was restarted again, this time with new parameters. In other words, they literally cheated, and the blue team, which would now be the Americans, ended up winning. But since the universe and geopolitical reality always prevail over any ideology, report, or political will, the Americans in real life ended up stuck in Iraq and Afghanistan and couldn't gather the necessary forces to invade Iran precisely because they realized it would be a disaster. Anyway, this conversation on Dalton Fisher's American podcast, along with other statements from military personnel, other CIA agents, and former politicians from that time, show that the Iranian paranoia of thinking they would be attacked to the west from Iraq, to the east from Afghanistan, and from the south by the American Navy was actually real. That was the plan, and Iran's proactive approach of keeping the Americans busy in Iraq using their Shiite militias was in fact a strategic move that prevented them from being the next target after the fall of Iraq. Today we can say the United States' entry into Iraq was one of history's greatest disasters. For the Americans, who ultimately ceded Middle East leadership to the Iranians, they gave the Chinese 20 years of breathing room and greatly reinforced their presence in the Pacific, the main geostrategic interest for the United States. They increased anti-American sentiment around the world, especially Islamic extremism, and increased authoritarianism within their own country using the excuse of fighting terrorism. A security structure that today has ended up being co-opted and used against the average American citizen themselves. In the future, make no mistake, the Iraq War will indeed be remembered as a true disaster. Thank you all, I hope you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share the video with everyone you know, to help the World Geopolitics channel keep growing. Hugs, see you next video.